Sepp Dietrich, Hitler's bodyguard. Sepp Dietrich was one of Adolf Hitler's most loyal and notorious followers. Born in 1892 in Bavaria, Dietrich grew up in a modest household before joining the German army during World War I. He was a brave soldier, wounded multiple times, and decorated with the Iron Cross. This early military service shaped his character and gave him the discipline that would later make him a key figure in Hitler's inner circle. After the war, Germany was a nation in turmoil. Veterans like Dietrich found themselves disillusioned and searching for purpose. It was in this chaotic environment that Dietrich discovered the rising National Socialist movement. Drawn to its promise to restoring German pride, he joined the Nazi Party in the early 1920s and quickly earned a reputation for his loyalty and toughness. Dietrich's path to prominence came through his relationship with Hitler himself. Unlike many Nazis who were more interested in politics, Dietrich was devoted to Hitler personally. In 1928, Hitler appointed him as one of his bodyguards, and from that moment, Dietrich's life became inseparably linked to the Führer. By 1932, Dietrich had risen to command the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, an elite SS unit formed specifically to protect Hitler. This unit began as a small bodyguard detachment, but quickly grew into a powerful military force. Under Dietrich's command, the Leibstandarte developed a reputation for discipline, loyalty, and ruthless efficiency. When Hitler seized power in 1933, Dietrich was at his side. He oversaw the expansion of the Leibstandarte into a regiment that became a cornerstone of the Waffen-SS. His devotion earned him rapid promotions, and by the outbreak of World War II, he was one of the most powerful men in Hitler's personal guard. Dietrich was not just a ceremonial guard. He led his troops into combat during the invasion of Poland in 1939 and later in the Western campaigns of 1940. Unlike some political generals, Dietrich was admired by his men as a soldier's soldier. He shared their hardships, treated them with respect, and became a symbol of SS fighting spirit. But Dietrich's loyalty to Hitler also drew him into darker roles. In 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, Dietrich and his men participated in the purge of the SA leadership, executing Hitler's rivals without hesitation. This cemented the SS's role as Hitler's personal weapon of terror, and Dietrich's reputation as a man willing to kill on command. As the war continued, Dietrich commanded SS units on the Eastern Front, where brutal fighting and atrocities against civilians were commonplace. His Leibstandarte became infamous not only for its battlefield successes, but also for war crimes committed under its watch. This dual legacy of bravery and brutality has made Dietrich one of the most controversial figures of the Nazi regime. By 1944, Dietrich had risen to the rank of SS Obergruppenführer, one of the highest in the SS hierarchy. He played a major role in the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, where his forces initially achieved success but ultimately failed. Hitler's trust in Dietrich never wavered, but the war was turning against Germany, and even his loyal bodyguard could not protect him from defeat. In the final days of the Reich, Dietrich remained at Hitler's side, still bound by the loyalty that had defined his entire career. When the war ended, he was captured by the Allies and later tried for war crimes. His life remains a stark reminder of how personal devotion can lead a man to participate in some of history's darkest events. Dietrich's power within the SS was not based on intellectual brilliance but on loyalty and charisma. Unlike Himmler, who was ideological and bureaucratic, Dietrich was more of a frontline commander, loved by his troops. This gave him a unique place in the Nazi hierarchy. He was both feared and respected, not only because of his closeness to Hitler, but also because of his ability to inspire those under his command. His soldiers admired him for leading from the front. Dietrich was known for sharing the dangers of combat, riding into battle with his men rather than directing from behind. This earned him the reputation of being approachable and humane to his troops, a sharp contrast to the ruthless image of the SS as a whole. It was this bond with his men that made the Leibstandarte one of the most formidable units in the German military. However, Dietrich's leadership also meant he was directly tied to the darker side of Nazi warfare. His unit was implicated in massacres and executions, particularly in Eastern Europe. Though he often claimed ignorance of these crimes, historians note that a commander of his stature could not have been completely unaware. His legacy is therefore one of deep contradiction, bravery on the battlefield, but complicity in atrocities. During the invasion of France in 1940, Dietrich's men distinguished themselves with rapid advances and fierce fighting. Hitler saw these victories as proof that his personal guard could be trusted not only for protection, but also as an elite fighting force. This success led to further expansion of the Waffen-SS, with Dietrich serving as one of its most prominent generals. By 1941, when Germany turned east against the Soviet Union, Dietrich was commanding larger formations than ever before. The Eastern Front was a brutal theater, and Dietrich's forces were often involved in the most intense battles, including the struggle for Kharkov and Kursk. His reputation as a fearless commander grew, but so too did the accusations of brutality associated with his men. The bond between Dietrich and Hitler was unusually personal. Hitler referred to him as Sepp, a term of familiarity, and often turned to him in moments of crisis. Dietrich in turn viewed Hitler as more than just a leader. He was almost a father figure, someone to whom Dietrich gave unwavering loyalty. This personal devotion distinguished him from many other Nazi leaders who saw Hitler as a means to power. In 1943, as the war dragged on, Dietrich was given command of the 1st SS Panzer Corps. His forces played major roles in battles across Italy and later in Normandy following the Allied invasion. The Leibstandarte, though depleted, continued to fight fiercely under his leadership, reinforcing his image as a determined and committed soldier, even as Germany's situation grew desperate. Perhaps Dietrich's most controversial moment came during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. His troops were involved in the Malmedy massacre, where American prisoners of war were executed by SS soldiers under his command. Though Dietrich denied giving such orders, the stain of this war crime would follow him for the rest of his life, eventually leading to his prosecution after the war. As Germany collapsed in 1945, Dietrich's loyalty never wavered. Even when defeat was inevitable, he continued to fight, unwilling to abandon Hitler. In the final days of the Reich, Dietrich remained one of the few high-ranking officers who had not betrayed or questioned the Führer. This blind loyalty, once a source of strength, ultimately tied him to the fall of the regime. Captured by the Allies after Germany's surrender, Dietrich faced trial at Nuremberg and later in Dachau for war crimes including the Malmedy massacre. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, later reduced to 25 years. Though released in the 1950s, he lived the rest of his life in obscurity, still admired by some of his former soldiers, but condemned by history as both a loyal soldier and a participant in one of the darkest chapters of humanity. Dietrich's life was deeply tied to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. Before the war, he had been one of the original members of Hitler's inner circle, personally guarding him at rallies and party meetings. This proximity gave him enormous influence, even though he was not a political thinker. He was proof that in Hitler's Germany, loyalty often mattered more than intellect or ideology. As the SS grew in size and power, Dietrich's Leibstandarte evolved from a small guard unit into a full mechanized division. This transformation symbolized the militarization of the Nazi state itself. What began as a personal bodyguard for one man became a war machine capable of devastating entire regions. And at the heart of this transformation stood Sepp Dietrich, the soldier who had pledged his life to Hitler. In combat, Dietrich earned respect not only from his men, but also from his enemies. Reports from Allied soldiers who faced his divisions in Normandy often spoke of their fierce determination and skill. Dietrich's units were rarely defeated in open battle. This military effectiveness, however, came at a terrible cost, as civilian populations often bore the brunt of SS brutality. Dietrich was not known for strategic brilliance in the way that commanders like Rommel or Manstein were. Instead, his strength lay in execution and morale. He was the kind of leader who inspired troops to keep fighting against overwhelming odds. For Hitler, this was invaluable. As Germany faced repeated defeats, he relied more than ever on men like Dietrich to hold the line. Yet this loyalty to Hitler would also be Dietrich's downfall. In the final months of the war, when Germany was collapsing, some generals urged surrender to spare lives. Dietrich refused. His devotion to Hitler blinded him to the reality of the situation. In a sense, he represented the tragic flaw of the Nazi elite, loyalty carried to the point of destruction. During the Battle of Berlin, although Dietrich was not in the city itself, he directed units that attempted to relieve the capital. These efforts were doomed from the start, but they illustrate his refusal to abandon Hitler, even when all hope was lost. For him, loyalty was not a choice, but a duty, even at the cost of his soldiers' lives. When Dietrich was captured by American forces in May 1945, his reputation as one of Hitler's closest companions made him a high-profile prisoner. Unlike many SS leaders who tried to distance themselves from Hitler, Dietrich openly admitted his devotion. This honesty, rare among captured Nazis, surprised his interrogators, but also sealed his fate in the trials that followed. At the Nuremberg trials, Dietrich faced charges related to the Waffen-SS and war crimes committed under his command. Though he denied personal responsibility, prosecutors argued that his position as commander made him culpable. His defense leaned heavily on the idea that he was a soldier, not a politician. But the atrocities associated with his units told another story. The Malmedy massacre trial was particularly significant. American prosecutors highlighted the execution of U.S. prisoners as a symbol of SS cruelty. Dietrich insisted he had never given such an order, and evidence suggested that lower-ranking officers carried out the killings. Still, as commander, he bore responsibility. This trial cemented his reputation as both a capable general and a war criminal. Imprisoned after the war, Dietrich lived in relative obscurity. Unlike Himmler, who took his own life, or Goering, who remained defiant, Dietrich faded quietly. His post-war years were marked by ill health and financial struggle. Yet he never renounced his loyalty to Hitler, continuing to speak of him with admiration even after the full extent of Nazi crimes was revealed. For some veterans of the Waffen-SS, Dietrich became a symbol of camaraderie and honor. To them, he was a leader who cared for his men, a stark contrast to the cold, ideological bureaucrats of the regime. This image of Dietrich as a soldier's soldier allowed him to retain a degree of respect among former comrades. Historians, however, have been less forgiving. While acknowledging his bravery and popularity among the troops, they emphasize his role in enabling Hitler's dictatorship and the atrocities of the SS. For them, Dietrich's story is not one of honor, but of the dangers of blind loyalty to a destructive leader. Dietrich's personality was also complex. He was not highly educated, and by most accounts, he lacked the intellectual sharpness of other Nazi leaders. Yet his emotional intelligence, His ability to connect with ordinary soldiers made him one of the most effective commanders in the SS. This blend of loyalty, charisma, and brutality defined his career. As the Cold War began, Dietrich's story faded from public view, overshadowed by larger figures like Himmler and Goebbels. Still, his case remains important for understanding how personal devotion to Hitler sustained the Nazi regime. Without men like Sepp Dietrich, Hitler's power would not have lasted as long as it did. Dietrich's death in 1966 closed the chapter on one of the last living links to Hitler's inner circle. His funeral was attended by former SS soldiers, some of whom still saw him as a hero. Yet to the wider world, he remained a convicted war criminal, remembered less for his courage in battle than for his role in one of history's darkest regimes. The story of Sepp Dietrich is ultimately one of contradictions. He was both admired and condemned, both loyal and guilty, both soldier and criminal. His life forces us to consider the question, can personal bravery and loyalty ever excuse complicity in evil? The answer, for most historians, is no. And yet studying figures like Dietrich is essential for understanding the mechanics of dictatorship. Hitler needed not just ideologues like Himmler or propagandists like Goebbels, but loyal warriors like Dietrich to hold his empire together. In this way, Dietrich's role becomes a vital piece of the puzzle in explaining how Nazi Germany functioned. The enduring lesson of Sepp Dietrich's life is the danger of placing loyalty above morality. His story reminds us that devotion, when misdirected, can become destructive. By tying his fate to Hitler, Dietrich ensured that his own legacy would forever be stained by association with tyranny and genocide. Today, Sepp Dietrich stands as a cautionary tale, a man who rose from humble beginnings to the heights of power, only to fall into disgrace because of the leader he chose to serve. His life reflects the broader tragedy of Nazi Germany: brilliance, courage, and loyalty twisted into instruments of destruction. Sepp Dietrich's journey began far from the grand stages of history. Born in 1892 in Hauingen, Bavaria, he grew up in a simple farming family. His childhood was shaped by rural traditions, discipline, and a sense of hard work that would later influence his military career. There was nothing in his early life to suggest that he would one day become one of Adolf Hitler's most trusted men. When World War I erupted in 1914, Dietrich enlisted in the German army, like millions of other young men. He served with distinction on the Western Front, experiencing the horrors of trench warfare and chemical weapons. For him, the war was both devastating and formative. The defeat of Germany in 1918 left him, like many veterans, disillusioned and resentful. After the war, Dietrich, like countless former soldiers, struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Jobs were scarce, inflation was rampant, and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles weighed heavily on the national psyche. For men like him, who had lived and fought in the trenches, civilian life seemed empty. The stage was set for radical movements to recruit disenchanted veterans. Dietrich drifted toward paramilitary groups known as the Freikorps, right-wing militias composed largely of ex-soldiers. These groups fought against communists, strikers, and uprisings across Germany. For Dietrich, this was familiar ground: the camaraderie of soldiers, the sense of mission, and the use of violence to achieve political ends. These experiences hardened him and brought him closer to extremist circles. By the early 1920s, Dietrich had crossed paths with Adolf Hitler, who was then a rising political agitator in Munich. Hitler needed loyal men who could provide security for Nazi rallies and protect him from opponents. Dietrich's background as a soldier and his reputation for toughness made him an ideal candidate. Thus began a partnership that would shape both men's destinies. Dietrich became part of Hitler's personal bodyguard, a role that gave him unique access to the future dictator. While many early Nazis jockeyed for political influence, Dietrich distinguished himself by his unwavering loyalty. He was not a strategist or an intellectual. Instead, he was a man who could be trusted to follow orders without question. The failed beer hall putsch of 1923 marked a turning point for both Hitler and Dietrich. Although the coup attempt collapsed, it revealed the determination of the Nazi movement. Dietrich remained committed to Hitler, even during his imprisonment. This steadfastness would not be forgotten, and it solidified his place among Hitler's inner circle. As the Nazi Party rose in the 1930s, Dietrich's role expanded. The SS, initially just a small group of bodyguards, grew into a formidable organization. Dietrich was instrumental in this transformation, helping mold the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's elite guard unit, into a disciplined military force. His men were fiercely loyal, bound by both ideology and personal devotion to Hitler. Dietrich's loyalty was tested during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when Hitler purged the leadership of the SA. Dietrich played a direct role in this bloody event, commanding units that arrested and executed rivals of the Führer. His willingness to act decisively during this crisis further elevated his standing. From this point onward, he was not just a guard, but a trusted enforcer. With the outbreak of World War II, Dietrich's military career entered its most prominent phase. He commanded the Leibstandarte in Poland, France, and later in the Balkans. His men quickly earned a reputation as both effective and ruthless. In France, they spearheaded daring advances, but they also left behind a trail of atrocities against civilians and prisoners. This dual image, brilliant soldiers but brutal occupiers, defined the Waffen-SS. During the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Dietrich's forces participated in Operation Barbarossa. The campaign revealed the sheer scale of Nazi ambition, as well as the cruelty of the war in the East. Dietrich's units fought ferociously, but they were also complicit in massacres and scorched earth tactics. The Eastern Front hardened him further, reinforcing the idea that total war required total brutality. Dietrich's closeness to Hitler meant he often bypassed traditional military channels. He could appeal directly to the Führer for supplies, reinforcements, or promotions, frustrating regular army officers. This privilege reflected Hitler's trust in Dietrich, but also deepened the rift between the Wehrmacht and the SS. Dietrich was not a brilliant strategist, but he was invaluable as a loyal commander. As the tide of the war turned against Germany, Dietrich's responsibilities grew heavier. He commanded entire SS armies in Italy and later in the Balkans. During the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944, his forces were among those tasked with repelling the Allied invasion. Though they fought fiercely, the overwhelming Allied air and naval power forced them into retreat. The Battle of the Bulge was perhaps Dietrich's most famous campaign. Hitler entrusted him with leading the 6th Panzer Army in the desperate counteroffensive in late 1944. While his troops initially achieved surprise, logistical failures and stiff Allied resistance doomed the operation. For Dietrich, it was both a moment of prominence and a reminder of Germany's declining fortunes. The Malmedy massacre, in which American prisoners of war were executed by SS troops under his overall command, haunted his legacy. Though evidence suggests he did not personally order the killings, his leadership role made him accountable. This atrocity became a symbol of the Waffen-SS's disregard for the rules of war. By early 1945, Dietrich's loyalty to Hitler remained unshaken, even as the Reich crumbled. When others considered surrender, he continued to fight. His soldiers, weary and outnumbered, respected his determination, but knew defeat was inevitable. In April, with Berlin under siege, Dietrich commanded units that tried to reach the capital. These last-ditch efforts failed, but they reflected his refusal to abandon Hitler. Captured by American forces in May 1945, Dietrich was interrogated extensively. Unlike many Nazis who tried to shift blame or reinvent themselves, he remained blunt and consistent. He admitted his devotion to Hitler and his role in the Waffen-SS, though he denied knowledge of specific crimes. His candor made him unusual, but did little to spare him from trial. The Nuremberg process and subsequent trials brought Dietrich face to face with justice. Convicted for his role in war crimes, he was sentenced to prison. The Malmedy trial, in particular, left him with a lasting stain. He insisted he had been a soldier, not a criminal, but international opinion was unforgiving. Dietrich served time in prison, during which his health deteriorated. His years behind bars reflected the collapse of the Nazi dream he had so faithfully served. Released in the mid-1950s, he lived quietly, though he maintained ties with former SS comrades. To the end, he never renounced Hitler, a fact that disturbed many who had hoped for reflection or remorse. Among veterans of the Waffen-SS, Dietrich retained a degree of respect. They remembered him as a commander who cared for his men and shared their hardships. For them, his loyalty was a virtue. Yet for historians, his story illustrates the dangers of such loyalty when it is directed toward a tyrant. Dietrich's death in 1966 marked the end of one of Hitler's most devoted followers. His funeral was attended by many former SS soldiers, a reminder of how memory and legacy can be contested. Some saw him as a fallen hero, others as a criminal who enabled one of history's greatest evils. In the decades since, scholars have debated Dietrich's legacy. Was he merely a soldier following orders, or was he an enabler of atrocities? The evidence points to the latter. His command positions and direct involvement in Hitler's purges make it clear that he was more than just a passive participant. Dietrich's lack of intellectual pretension made him different from other Nazi elites. He was not a schemer like Himmler or a propagandist like Goebbels. He was a man of action, defined by loyalty and brutality. In some ways, this made him more dangerous, for he represented the ordinary soldier elevated to extraordinary crimes. For modern audiences, Dietrich's life offers lessons about the risks of blind obedience. It shows how ordinary virtues, loyalty, courage, determination,
The early life and formation of a genius. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day 1642 in the small hamlet of Woolsthorpe, England. His arrival was dramatic. He was so small and frail that his mother later recalled she thought he could fit inside a quart mug. His father, a farmer also named Isaac Newton, had died 3 months earlier, leaving him fatherless before he had drawn his first breath. In the bitter winter of the English countryside, Newton's life began under the shadow of uncertainty. When Newton was just 3 years old, his mother, Hannah Iscott Newton, remarried and left him in the care of his grandmother. This separation left a deep mark on him. Throughout his life, Newton would struggle with trust and relationships, preferring solitude over social engagement. The boy who would one day explain the motions of the planet was first a lonely child wandering the fields of rural Lincolnshire. Newton attended the King's School in Grantham, where he was known as a quiet and reserved student, more interested in drawing and mechanical devices than in the rough games of other boys. He boarded in the home of an apothecary, where he developed a fascination with chemistry and the workings of nature. Even as a teenager, he filled notebooks with sketches of windmills, sundials, and models of water wheels. His early years were not without difficulty. Newton was initially a poor student, often ranked low in his class. A turning point came when he was bullied by an older boy. Newton fought back, not with fists, but with a determination to surpass his classmates academically. From that moment, he rose to the top of his class, a position he maintained through relentless self-study and tireless curiosity. In 1661, Newton entered Trinity College at the University of Cambridge. At first, he studied the traditional curriculum, Aristotelian philosophy, classical languages, and theology. But the young scholar was restless. He spent much of his time reading works that were considered unorthodox or even dangerous: Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, and Kepler. The seeds of a scientific revolution were already taking root in his mind. By 1665, the bubonic plague reached Cambridge, forcing the university to close its doors. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe, and what might have been a lost year became instead the most productive period of his life. Alone in his family home, he began a series of private studies that would change the course of science forever. It was during this time that Newton began formulating the basic principles of calculus, a new form of mathematics that would allow him to describe change and motion with unprecedented precision. He also conducted experiments with light, using prisms to split sunlight into a spectrum of colors, challenging the prevailing belief that white light was pure and unalterable. Legend has it that during this same period, Newton observed an apple fall from a tree in his garden. The story has been romanticized, but the essence is true. This simple observation led him to consider why objects fall to the earth and whether the same force might govern the motion of the moon and planets. From this seed grew his theory of universal gravitation. Newton's solitary work in Woolsthorpe between 1665 and 1667 is now referred to as his Annus Mirabilis, or Year of Wonders. In less than 2 years, he laid the foundations for calculus, optics, and the law of gravitation. These ideas would take decades to refine, but their origin lay in the quiet of the English countryside, far from the lecture halls of Cambridge. When Newton returned to the university in 1667, he was no longer just a diligent student. He was a man carrying the keys to unlock the mysteries of the universe. His professors recognized his extraordinary abilities, and he was soon elected a Fellow of Trinity College, setting the stage for a lifetime of discovery.
The rise of a scientific titan. Back at Cambridge, Newton's brilliance quickly caught the attention of Isaac Barrow, then Lucasian professor of mathematics. Barrow, recognizing Newton's extraordinary talent, resigned his position in 1669 so that the young scholar could succeed him. Newton, at just 27 years old, now held one of the most prestigious chairs in the academic world, a role that would give him both authority and a platform for his revolutionary ideas. One of Newton's earliest major contributions as a professor was his work on optics. Using a series of ingenious experiments with glass prisms, he proved that white light is composed of all the colors of the visible spectrum. This finding challenged the dominant theories of light, particularly those of René Descartes, and set Newton apart as a bold, independent thinker. Newton's optical discoveries were not just theoretical. He designed and built the first practical reflecting telescope, using mirrors instead of lenses to eliminate chromatic aberration. His design produced a clearer, sharper image than anything previously achieved, and it earned him membership in the Royal Society in 1672. Yet even as he was being honored, controversy was brewing. His published paper on light and color drew criticism from Robert Hooke, one of England's most influential scientists. Hooke claimed that Newton's theory was flawed, and that he himself had conducted similar experiments earlier. This dispute ignited a rivalry that would simmer for decades, with Newton becoming increasingly defensive and secretive about his work. Newton's temperament was famously difficult. He had little patience for what he saw as ignorance or opposition, and he could harbor grudges for years. His clashes with Hooke were intense, often personal, and they shaped his approach to publishing. Newton would hold back his greatest ideas for fear of criticism and misinterpretation. Despite the disputes, Newton continued to push forward. His next great challenge was to understand the force that governed both falling apples and orbiting planets. The question was deceptively simple: why does the moon not fall to Earth, and why do planets follow curved paths around the sun? Newton suspected that a single universal force was at play. Drawing on the work of Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei, Newton began to mathematically describe the motion of bodies under the influence of gravity. He imagined a force extending across space, decreasing in strength with distance, yet never disappearing entirely. If his calculations were correct, the same force pulling an apple to the ground kept the moon in its orbit. By the mid-1670s, Newton had the core of his gravitational theory, but he hesitated to publish. His tendency toward isolation deepened, and he withdrew from much of Cambridge life, burying himself in his studies. He explored not just mathematics and physics, but also alchemy, biblical prophecy, and theology, subjects considered fringe by many of his contemporaries. Newton's alchemical pursuits, while unscientific by modern standards, reflected his belief that nature's secrets were hidden and interconnected. He saw himself not just as a scientist, but as a decipherer of God's creation, seeking the hidden code that governed all reality. In 1684, Newton's quiet life was interrupted by Edmund Halley, the astronomer who would later have a comet named after him. Halley visited Newton to discuss the laws of planetary motion and was astonished when Newton claimed he had already solved the problem years earlier. Pressed for details, Newton produced the mathematical proofs that would become the basis for one of the most important books in history. This collaboration with Halley led directly to the writing of Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or simply the Principia. Newton worked tirelessly on the manuscript, refining his laws of motion and gravitation into a unified framework that explained the movements of the heavens and the earth alike. The Principia, published in 1687, was an intellectual earthquake. It introduced the three laws of motion, principles that still underpin modern physics, and described gravity as a universal force acting between all objects. For the first time, the cosmos could be understood through precise mathematical laws rather than mystical speculation. The reaction was profound. Scientists across Europe hailed the work as a masterpiece, though some, including Hooke, continued to challenge Newton's conclusions. But the tide had turned. Newton's vision of a universe governed by natural laws had taken hold, and it would shape science for centuries to come. The Principia also marked a personal transformation for Newton. He was no longer a reclusive scholar hidden in Cambridge. He was now the most celebrated scientist in the world. But fame brought new challenges, as his position at the center of scientific debate exposed him to more public criticism and political entanglements. In the years following the publication, Newton became increasingly involved in the affairs of the Royal Society, eventually rising to its presidency. From this position, he wielded immense influence over the direction of English science, sometimes to the benefit of discovery, and sometimes to settle old scores. Even at the height of his success, Newton's drive to uncover deeper truths did not wane. He saw each solved problem as a doorway to another mystery, and his relentless pursuit of knowledge would lead him into both remarkable discoveries and bitter disputes in the decades ahead.
The power, politics, and paranoia of Sir Isaac Newton. Following the monumental success of the Principia, Newton's life took a significant turn. In 1689, he entered politics, serving as a member of Parliament for the University of Cambridge. Although his time in the House of Commons was brief and largely uneventful, he reportedly spoke only once to ask for a window to be closed. It marked the beginning of his public life beyond pure science. Newton's increasing prominence brought him into contact with England's elite, including members of the royal court. His reputation as a scientific genius opened doors, but it also exposed him to the world of influence, patronage, and political maneuvering. a world very different from the academic cloisters of Cambridge. In 1689, Newton entered politics, serving as a member of Parliament for the University of Cambridge. Although his time in the House of Commons was brief and largely uneventful, he reportedly spoke only once to ask for a window to be closed. It marked the beginning of his public life beyond pure science. Newton's increasing prominence brought him into contact with England's elite, including members of the royal court. His reputation as a scientific genius opened doors, but it also exposed him to the world of influence, patronage, and political maneuvering, a world very different from the academic cloisters of Cambridge. In 1696, Newton accepted a new and unexpected role: Warden of the Royal Mint. This position placed him in charge of England's currency at a time when counterfeiting was rampant. Newton approached the task with his characteristic thoroughness, reorganizing coin production and personally overseeing the pursuit of counterfeiters. His dedication to the mint was not merely administrative. Newton took an almost detective-like interest in tracking down forgers, going so far as to disguise himself and gather intelligence in London's taverns and back alleys. His relentless efforts led to the arrest and execution of several notorious criminals, further cementing his image as a man of action as well as intellect. By 1699, Newton was appointed Master of the Mint, a role he would hold for the rest of his life. Under his leadership, Britain's currency system was stabilized, and the quality of coinage improved dramatically. Yet this new chapter in his life pulled him further away from the frontiers of pure scientific research. In 1703, Newton was elected President of the Royal Society, finally replacing his longtime adversary, Robert Hooke. Some accounts suggest that Newton used his position to erase Hooke's influence from the Society's records, even removing his portrait. Whether out of personal animosity or a desire to reshape the Society's legacy, Newton now had unrivaled authority in British science. With his leadership came an era of both progress and control. Newton championed research that aligned with his vision while marginalizing those who challenged them. His disputes were no longer just academic debates. They were battles for dominance in the scientific community. One of the most famous of these conflicts was with the German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz over the invention of calculus. Both men had developed similar methods independently, but accusations of plagiarism flew in both directions. Under Newton's presidency, the Royal Society conducted an investigation that unsurprisingly favored Newton's version of events. The Newton-Leibniz controversy divided European mathematics into two camps: British mathematicians loyal to Newton's methods and continental scholars aligned with Leibniz. The rift slowed the exchange of ideas and arguably delayed mathematical progress in Britain for decades. Despite these contentious episodes, Newton continued to be showered with honors. In 1705, he was knighted by Queen Anne, becoming Sir Isaac Newton. This was a rare distinction for a scientist at the time and symbolized his transformation from reclusive academic to national figure. Yet fame and power also seemed to deepen Newton's natural tendency towards suspicion. He guarded his reputation fiercely and often saw conspiracies where none existed. His private writings from this period reveal a man deeply concerned with loyalty, legacy, and divine purpose. In his later years at the Mint and the Royal Society, Newton focused increasingly on administrative duties and theological study. He poured countless hours into biblical chronology, convinced that the scriptures contained coded messages about the end of the world. To him, science and religion were not separate realms, but two paths to the same ultimate truth. By the 1720s, Newton's health began to decline. Nevertheless, he remained active in public life, attending meetings, advising political leaders, and receiving guests eager to meet the greatest scientists of the age. His very presence was seen as a living embodiment of the Enlightenment's ideals. Newton never married, and his personal life remained private and somewhat enigmatic. Friends and acquaintances described him as courteous but reserved, capable of warmth, but also sudden flashes of temper when challenged. His final years were marked by a mix of reverence from the public and ongoing disputes in scholarly circles. Even in his 70s, Newton was not immune to controversy, and he continued to defend his scientific achievements against real or imagined detractors. On March 31, 1727, Sir Isaac Newton died in his sleep at the age of 84. He was buried with great ceremony in Westminster Abbey, an honor usually reserved for monarchs and statesmen. The funeral was attended by England's most powerful figures, a testament to his extraordinary impact. Newton's death closed a chapter in human history. He had transformed the way we understand the universe, marrying mathematical precision with a vision of cosmic order. His laws of motion and gravitation became the foundation of physics. His work on optics changed how we see light, and his intellectual legacy influenced generations of scientists, philosophers, and thinkers. Yet Newton the man was as complex as his theories: brilliant, ambitious, combative, and deeply human.
The Age of Newton: Legacy and Influence. After Newton's death in 1727, his legacy did not fade. Instead, it grew into something almost mythic. In Britain, he was hailed as the man who had unlocked the very clockwork of the cosmos. His portrait appeared in homes, lecture halls, and scientific societies, cementing his image as the intellectual father of the Enlightenment. In the decades that followed, Newton's Principia was studied by generations of scientists who saw his mathematical laws as the ultimate truth of nature. The idea that the universe operated under fixed, rational laws inspired not only physicists, but also philosophers, political thinkers, and even economists. This Newtonian worldview reshaped the European intellectual landscape. It suggested that human affairs, like the physical world, could be governed by reason and predictable patterns. Governments, legal systems, and social theorists began to see themselves as engineers of a rational society. Newton's reputation was carefully cultivated by admirers and institutions. The Royal Society promoted him as the greatest of all scientists, a symbol of Britain's intellectual supremacy. His burial in Westminster Abbey reinforced the idea that science could stand alongside religion as the pillar of national greatness. Across the Channel in France, Newton's ideas sparked fierce debate. While many embraced his theories, others, particularly followers of Descartes, resisted the Newtonian model of gravity acting at a distance. But as experiments confirmed his predictions, the opposition weakened, and Newton's physics became the foundation of European science. The spread of Newton's ideas was aided by popular works such as Voltaire's Elements of Newton's Philosophy, which simplified his theories for a broader audience. Voltaire and other Enlightenment figures saw Newton as the ultimate example of reason triumphing over superstition. By the mid-18th century, Newtonianism had become a cultural phenomenon. Public lectures demonstrated experiments with prisms, pendulums, and telescopes, thrilling audiences who wanted to witness Newton's laws in action. Science was no longer just for scholars. It was entertainment, education, and national pride. This period also saw Newton's methods applied beyond astronomy and physics. Mathematicians developed his calculus further, engineers used his principles to design machines, and navigators relied on his understanding of gravity to improve sea travel. In America, the Founding Fathers read Newton alongside political philosophers. Thomas Jefferson admired him deeply, and Benjamin Franklin, himself a scientist, saw Newton's rationality as a model for enlightened governance. Newton's influence thus crossed oceans and shaped emerging nations. However, Newton's status as an intellectual hero also made him a target for myth-making. Stories about his life, some true, others exaggerated, were retold until they became legend. The tale of the falling apple, for example, became symbolic of sudden inspiration, even though the reality was far more complex. By the 19th century, Newton's scientific framework seemed unshakable. His laws of motion and universal gravitation explained everything from planetary orbits to the behavior of cannonballs. Textbooks presented his theories as complete and final, the bedrock of physical science. But as his fame grew, so did scrutiny. Historians began to uncover the less celebrated aspects of his life, his alchemical experiments, his obsession with biblical prophecy, and his fierce rivalries. Newton was no longer just a saint of science. He was a human being with contradictions. In art and literature, Newton appeared as a figure of almost divine wisdom. Romantic poets such as William Wordsworth both admired and questioned the mechanical view of nature he inspired. To some, Newton's laws revealed the beauty of the universe. To others, they stripped away its mystery. Meanwhile, scientific progress continued to build on Newton's foundation. Astronomers refined his calculations, chemists adopted his experimental rigor, and mathematicians expanded his methods. For over 200 years, no one could challenge the authority of his physics. Even as the Industrial Revolution transformed society, Newton's vision of a predictable, ordered universe gave reassurance to an age of rapid change. His name became synonymous with precision, innovation, and the power of the human mind. In classrooms around the world, young students learned about Newton not just as a historical figure, but as the model of what a scientist should be: curious, disciplined, and relentless in pursuit of truth. By the late 1800s, Newton's laws were applied to everything from steam engines to bridge construction. The expansion of the British Empire carried Newtonian science to colonies and trading posts, spreading his influence to the farthest corners of the globe. However, by the end of the 19th century, faint cracks began to appear in the Newtonian worldview. New discoveries in electromagnetism, thermodynamics, and atomic theory hinted that the universe might be more complex than Newton's equations allowed. But for now, his framework still reigns supreme. Newton had become more than a man. He was a monument. His influence shaped the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the very way humans thought about nature. For over 2 centuries,
The fall and rebirth of Newtonian physics. As the 20th century dawned, Newton's universe still seemed eternal. His laws were the scaffolding on which science was built, and his equations described the clockwork precision of the cosmos. But hidden within the smallest scales of matter and the fastest speeds in the universe, cracks were beginning to appear. Astronomers noticed that Mercury's orbit did not perfectly match Newton's predictions. For decades, scientists tried to explain the anomaly, searching for an undiscovered planet or hidden force. The mystery lingered until Albert Einstein unveiled his theory of general relativity in 1915, a revolutionary model that redefined gravity itself. Einstein did not dismiss Newton. Instead, he expanded upon him. Newton's gravity had been a force acting at a distance, but Einstein's vision saw it as the curvature of space and time. It was as if the universe's machinery had been revealed in a deeper, more intricate way. Meanwhile, in the realm of the very small, quantum mechanics shattered the Newtonian ideal of predictability. The subatomic world did not move like a precise machine, but behaved according to probabilities and uncertainty. For the first time in over 2 centuries, Newton's framework no longer described all of reality. To some, these scientific revolutions seemed to dethrone Newton. Yet many physicists argued that his work remained the bedrock of science. His laws were still accurate for everyday life, engineering, and space travel. Einstein and quantum physics simply took over where Newton's rules no longer applied. In this way, Newton's influence persisted even in the face of new paradigms. NASA engineers still used his equations to calculate rocket trajectories. Architects designing skyscrapers relied on Newtonian mechanics to ensure stability. Airplane pilots depended on it for flight navigation. Culturally, Newton's story gained new significance. He became the symbol of human progress, proof that with reason, observation, and mathematics, humanity could uncover nature's deepest secrets. His life was studied in classrooms not just as history, but as a model for intellectual achievement. Even Einstein acknowledged his debt to Newton. In speeches and writings, Einstein referred to standing on the shoulders of giants, echoing Newton's own famous phrase. The lineage of modern science was clear. Newton had lit the torch that others carried forward. In the mid-20th century, the space race rekindled global fascination with Newton. Television broadcasts explained how Newton's laws of motion made moon landings possible. Children watched rockets rise from launch pads, each powered by mathematics Newton had written centuries earlier. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Newton's image adorned stamps, coins, and even the British £1 note. Museums dedicated exhibitions to his discoveries, and scholars continued to unearth manuscripts revealing his private obsessions with alchemy, theology, and prophecy. The complexity of Newton's personality became part of his enduring mystique. He was no longer seen as a flawless genius, but as a deeply human figure, brilliant yet secretive, methodical yet obsessive, a man whose mind spanned the scientific and the mystical. Popular culture embraced Newton in unexpected ways. His laws were referenced in films, literature, and even marketing campaigns. The falling apple remained a universal symbol for sudden inspiration, used by everyone from educators to technology companies. In academic circles, historians examined how Newton's ideas fit into a broader story of human thought. He was not an isolated genius, but part of a chain of discovery stretching back to ancient Greece and forward to modern physics. His genius lay in synthesizing the work of others and pushing it to new heights. Even in the digital age, Newton's methods, observation, experiment, and mathematical reasoning remained the foundation of scientific research. Whether in particle physics or climate modeling, scientists still followed the path he had carved. Newton's life story also became a mirror for the tension between science and belief. His deep religious convictions and fascination with prophecy challenged the stereotype of the purely rational scientist, showing that the boundaries between science and spirituality could be more fluid than modern thinkers often assume. In education, Newton's legacy was secure. His laws of motion and universal gravitation were still taught in high schools worldwide, forming the first step into the world of physics for millions of students each year. As the 21st century progressed, new discoveries such as dark matter, dark energy, and the expanding universe continued to reshape our understanding of reality. But in many ways, these were extensions of the same quest Newton had begun: to understand the rules by which the cosmos operates. Today, Isaac Newton stands not just as a historical figure, but as a timeless symbol of curiosity and intellect. His ideas may have been refined, expanded, and in some cases surpassed, but the foundations he laid remain unshakable. In the end, Newton's genius was not that he had all the answers, but that he knew how to ask the right questions. That spirit, the fearless search for truth, ensures that his influence will never fade no matter how far science advances.
The early morning calm over Pearl Harbor was shattered on December 7, 1941. But the plan that led to the attack had been set in motion long before the first bombs fell. At the center of that storm was a man few Americans knew, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a strategic genius, a reluctant warrior, and the architect behind one of the most infamous military operations in history. Born in 1884 into a samurai family, Yamamoto grew up with discipline and duty carved into his soul. He joined the Imperial Japanese Navy and quickly distinguished himself, not just through skill, but through intellect. Unlike many in his circle, Yamamoto had studied abroad in the United States. He spoke English, studied at Harvard, and even toured American industry firsthand. It was this experience that shaped Yamamoto's unique perspective. He admired America's industrial might and warned Japan's leadership of its power. "If I am told to fight," he said, "I will run wild for 6 months, but I have no confidence for the second or third year." He understood the gamble of awakening a sleeping giant. Yet, despite his caution, Yamamoto carried out his duty. Once Japan committed to war, he crafted a plan to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single, decisive strike. The objective was clear: delay American retaliation, buy time for Japan's expansion, and force a negotiation from a position of strength. Operation Z was born, an audacious attack that would involve stealth, coordination, and surprise. Aircraft carriers would travel thousands of miles undetected, launching more than 350 planes in a wave of destruction. The target? Pearl Harbor. The stakes? Global war. On the morning of the attack, Yamamoto waited aboard his flagship. He knew the mission's success could change history, and it did. 8 American battleships were damaged or sunk. Over 2,400 lives were lost. For Japan, it was a stunning tactical victory. For the U.S., it was a moment of national trauma and unification. But Yamamoto didn't celebrate. When told of the success, he reportedly muttered, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." It wasn't humility, it was foresight. Yamamoto had seen the American spirit up close, and he feared what would come next. In the months that followed, the tide of war turned. The Battle of Midway shattered Japan's momentum. Yamamoto, still the supreme naval commander, began to see his strategy unravel. The U.S. was rebuilding faster than Japan could strike. The sleeping giant was not just awake, it was enraged. In 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Yamamoto's flight plans. Determined to remove Japan's brightest mind, the U.S. launched a daring mission, Operation Vengeance. Over Bougainville, Yamamoto's plane was ambushed and shot down. The mastermind of Pearl Harbor was dead. Admiral Yamamoto's legacy is one of brilliance, burden, and irony. He didn't crave war. He tried to prevent it. Yet when duty called, he authored one of its darkest chapters. His story reminds us that even the most brilliant minds can be trapped by the machinery of war. Yamamoto's brilliance extended beyond Pearl Harbor. He pioneered Japan's carrier-first doctrine, believing that air power, not battleships, would define modern naval warfare. In this, he was ahead of his time. His influence reshaped Japan's naval structure and echoed even into U.S. strategy post-war. Despite his rank, Yamamoto was often politically isolated. He disagreed with Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany and the path of aggressive militarism. His American sympathies earned him enemies among Japan's ultranationalists, but the emperor respected his strategic mind and trusted him with command. Privately, Yamamoto carried emotional scars. He lost friends in the Russo-Japanese War. He lost 2 fingers at the Battle of Tsushima. And he knew the human cost of every decision he made. His calm exterior often masked the weight of leading men to death. To American historians, Yamamoto remains a paradox. He was both enemy and admirer, a warrior who quoted Abraham Lincoln, a strategist who had tasted Coca-Cola in New York, then ordered attacks on American soil. His life defied simple labels, making him all the more fascinating. Operation Vengeance, the U.S. plan to intercept and kill Yamamoto, was controversial. Never before had a targeted military assassination been so openly pursued. But in war, ideology fades. Removing the brain behind Japan's navy was deemed necessary to save thousands of Allied lives. Yamamoto's final flight was scheduled to boost morale in Japanese-held islands, but U.S. cryptographers using magic intercepts cracked the message. American P-38 fighters launched from Guadalcanal, flying 400 miles into enemy territory just to find one man. The ambush over Bougainville was swift. Yamamoto's transport was hit and crashed into the jungle. For days, his body remained unclaimed. When found, he was still seated, hand on his sword, as if accepting the fate he had long predicted. The mastermind had met the end he foresaw. Back home, Yamamoto's death was mourned with national ceremony. Yet even in mourning, Japanese commanders felt the blow to morale. They had lost not just a commander, but their sharpest mind. Their successors struggled to match his discipline, daring, and understanding of their enemy. In American minds, Pearl Harbor would forever remain Yamamoto's nameplate. But his story goes deeper than bombs and fire. It's about leadership under pressure, strategy under scrutiny, and the burden of serving a nation even when you fear the direction it takes. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did not survive the war, but his impact shaped it. His planning shook the world, his warnings proved prophetic, and his life reminds us war is rarely black and white. Often the most dangerous men are those who know exactly what war costs. In the United States, Yamamoto's name became etched into history as the villain of Pearl Harbor. But within military circles, even among his adversaries, there was respect. American commanders studied his tactics. His ability to coordinate long-range attacks and mobilize carrier fleets left an indelible mark on modern warfare. Yamamoto's role also highlighted the growing power of air supremacy. Pearl Harbor demonstrated that battleships alone no longer ruled the seas. It was aircraft, fast, flexible, and devastating, that would shape naval battles to come. This shift, first predicted by Yamamoto, became reality in the Pacific theater. In Japanese propaganda, Yamamoto was a national hero. His image appeared in newspapers, posters, and newsreels. But within himself, he wrestled with guilt. He believed in duty, but hated war. His death turned him into a symbol, both for Imperial Japan and for those who questioned it. His Harvard education and time in America made him uniquely aware of Japan's limitations. He urged modernization, advocated for stronger diplomacy, and opposed reckless expansion. But once orders came, he obeyed with precision. A soldier of empire, bound by loyalty more than belief. The loss of Yamamoto in 1943 marked a turning point. It wasn't just a tactical loss, it was psychological. Japanese morale declined, leadership cohesion faltered, and the U.S. intensified its island-hopping campaign with renewed determination, knowing their greatest naval rival was gone. For Japan, the war spiraled toward disaster. Cities burned, the Navy weakened, and by 1945, atomic fire brought surrender. One wonders how different Japan's path might have been if its leaders had listened to Yamamoto's early warnings, if war had been avoided altogether. After the war, Yamamoto's reputation was reconsidered. Historians saw him as a tragic figure, a realist forced to carry out an unrealistic war. Neither blindly nationalist nor anti-American, he stood apart from the extremists of his time, focused more on results than rhetoric. His leadership style was defined by discipline and intellect. He inspired loyalty, but demanded excellence. He challenged assumptions, embraced innovation, and led from the front. In a world full of shouting generals, Yamamoto's calm calculation stood out. Today, Yamamoto remains one of history's most complex military figures. Neither a war criminal nor a martyr, he sits in the gray space between villain and visionary. His legacy forces us to ask deeper questions about war, leadership, and what it means to serve a country you don't always agree with. In the end, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto changed the course of World War II. His strike on Pearl Harbor awakened a nation, ignited global conflict, and shaped the rise and fall of empires. His story is not just Japan's, it belongs to all of us who seek to understand the true cost of war. Few military minds in modern history have left as lasting an impression as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Born in 1884 into a humble samurai family, Yamamoto rose through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy with a sharp mind and an unwavering sense of duty. He wasn't just a commander, he was a strategist who foresaw how global war would evolve. Yamamoto studied at the Japanese Naval Academy, but his transformation truly began when he traveled to the United States. At Harvard University, and later as naval attaché in Washington, he immersed himself in American culture and technology, gaining a deep understanding of the U.S., its strengths, weaknesses, and mindset. He admired America's industrial power and warned his peers, if provoked, the United States would become an unstoppable force. Yamamoto famously stated, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." But despite his objections, Japan charged toward war, and he was asked to lead the first strike. That strike came on December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto orchestrated one of the most daring surprise attacks in military history. In just under 2 hours, much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. The world stood stunned. Japan had delivered a powerful opening blow. But the attack was not without regret. Yamamoto had opposed war with the U.S., believing it would only lead to disaster. Once the decision was made, however, he executed the plan with ruthless precision. He believed in doing his duty, even when he disagreed with the mission. Pearl Harbor changed the world. Overnight, the United States entered World War II, but Yamamoto knew better than to celebrate. "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." His words would prove prophetic. Yamamoto shifted focus to maintaining Japan's momentum. He championed the development of aircraft carriers and long-range bombing raids. He modernized the fleet, adapting Japan's strategy to rely on mobility and surprise rather than traditional naval strength. The Battle of Midway was a critical turning point. Yamamoto's complex plans were undone by American codebreakers. The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, a devastating blow. Yamamoto was shaken. His empire had overreached. His 6-month window had closed. Behind the scenes, Yamamoto remained a controversial figure. Many within Japan's military elite distrusted him for his American sympathies. Yet his loyalty to the emperor and his country never wavered. He was a samurai at heart, strategic, disciplined, and honorable. In 1943, Yamamoto planned a morale-boosting tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. Unbeknownst to him, American cryptographers intercepted the travel plans. Operation Vengeance was born, an unprecedented mission to assassinate the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. American P-38 Lightning fighters flew a 1,000-mile round trip, an astonishing feat of navigation and precision. Over Bougainville Island, they spotted Yamamoto's transport plane. In a flash, the aircraft was shot down. Yamamoto, always calm under fire, died in the jungle. His body was later found still in uniform, hand resting on his katana, a symbol of composure in death as in life. The empire held a grand state funeral. Millions mourned, but Japan's war machine had lost its brain. The Navy would never recover its precision. In America, Yamamoto's death was hailed as justice for Pearl Harbor. Yet many U.S. commanders secretly respected his mind. General MacArthur once remarked that Yamamoto was the only Japanese admiral who could have won the war. Now, that chance was gone. As the war dragged on, Japan fell deeper into desperation. Leaders who replaced Yamamoto lacked his vision. Battles were fought without cohesion. Strategy gave way to suicide missions. The empire, once surgical in attack, now bled in chaos. In post-war Japan, Yamamoto became a polarizing symbol. To some, he was the sword of the emperor, brave and honorable. To others, he was the architect of Japan's downfall. But few doubted his brilliance or his tragic foresight. Today, scholars view Yamamoto as a realist in a militarist regime. He didn't thirst for conquest. He feared war. But when tasked with executing it, he did so with unmatched efficiency. His genius was neither celebrated nor fully understood until long after his death. His career offers a lesson in moral conflict. In the face of ideology, Yamamoto stood for reason. In a world rushing toward war, he counseled caution. In command, he showed that leadership isn't about belief, it's about bearing responsibility for its consequences. While Pearl Harbor remains his most infamous act, Yamamoto's legacy is more than destruction. He represented a shift in warfare, a turning point in naval thinking. He combined Eastern honor with Western intellect, a duality that made him both feared and admired. Admiral Yamamoto was not a hero in the conventional sense, nor was he a villain without depth. He was a man who understood both the brilliance and futility of war. His story challenges us to look past battles and study the minds that planned them. In the smoke of Pearl Harbor and the jungles of Bougainville, the legend of Yamamoto endures. He is a figure carved not just in history books, but in the fabric of modern military thought. A master of war burdened by the tragedy he foresaw and could not prevent.